Well, let's take you live right now to the Transportation Safety Board, releasing a report on its investigation into the ferry crash at the Jack Layton Terminal 2 years ago. Let's listen live.
22 occurrence where the passenger ferry Sam McBride struck the dock at the Jack Layton Ferry Terminal here in Toronto, Ontario, resulting in approximately 20 passengers being injured, 6 of whom were taken to hospital. Our investigation found several safety deficiencies related to passenger safety management and emergency preparedness. I'll now turn things over to the investigator in charge, Etienne, who will explain how the event unfolded and what our investigation found.
Thank you, Kathy. On the afternoon of August 20th, 2022, the Sam McBride departed Center Island towards Toronto Jack Layton Ferry Terminal with 6 crew members and approximately 910 passengers on board. Earlier that day, the ferry had completed 8 crossings, 6 of which were at full capacity. It was behind schedule, which is not unusual on a busy summer day. Shortly after 5 p.m. local time, the ferry struck the dock while berthing at the terminal, resulting in approximately 20 passengers being injured, mainly from losing their footing and falling. The Sam McBride is a double-ended ferry, meaning that it has propellers at both ends of the vessel. Our analysis of security footage from the voyage determined that the vessel was approaching the dock faster than it had on an earlier trip that day. The footage also showed that only the back-end propeller was turning as it was approaching, given the vessel's speed and distance from running behind schedule. Following this occurrence, the City of Toronto put in place documented procedures for berthing. When the TSB investigates an occurrence, we look not only at a specific event, but also the circumstances around it. During our investigation, we found several safety deficiencies related to passenger safety management and emergency preparedness. Under the Marine Personnel Regulations, vessels are required to have a safe manning document issued by Transport Canada, which sets out the minimum number of qualified crew members needed to ensure safety in various scenarios. In 2009, Transport Canada evaluated that a minimum of 13 crew members were required for the Sam McBride. However, following a request by the City of Toronto, Transport Canada allowed the ferry to operate with only 6 crew members and without verifying that any mitigation procedures were in place to offset a smaller crew in the event of an emergency. The safe manning document was subsequently renewed every 5 years without revisions or modifications. Our investigation determined that if there had been a fire on board or a need to evacuate the vessel, there would not be enough crew members to effectively respond. Crew members would have to be in 2 places at once. 3 crew members would be assigned to respond to the emergency, leaving only 3 crew members to oversee the management of over 900 passengers and the possible evacuation of all people on board. While thankfully there were few serious injuries reported and the accident happened close to shore, if an emergency had arisen over the course of the voyage, the crew and those on board will not have been properly prepared. The safety issues raised today are not new. Many of these issues have been found in other investigations of Canadian passenger vessels. Following one investigation in particular, the board raised concern about the lack of requirements for infant life jackets, the lack of assessment of passenger evacuation procedures, and the gap in training in passenger safety management. Kathy will now tell you about the 3 recommendations the board is issuing today.
Emergencies usually develop rapidly, and passengers who are unlikely to be familiar with the vessel and its equipment rely on the fast and coordinated actions of the crew to keep them safe. This is why ferry vessel crew members need to have the knowledge and skills related to crowd management and human behavior in emergencies. None of the crew members of the Sam McBride had received such training, and nor were they required to. In 2017, the TSB issued a safety concern about the lack of a requirement for training in passenger safety management for crew members on all vessels carrying more than 12 passengers in sheltered waters, such as rivers, harbors, and small lakes. To date, Transport Canada has yet to implement any requirements for passenger management training to address this concern, leaving crews unprepared to manage passengers in emergency situations. For this reason, the board recommends that Transport Canada implement a requirement for crew members of all passenger vessels, including those on sheltered waters voyages, to complete appropriate training in passenger safety management. Our next recommendation relates to passenger vessel evacuation procedures. We know the importance of conducting realistic emergency drills. Realistic drills require a large number of people acting as passengers and must include the deployment of life-saving equipment to evaluate if the emergency procedures are practical. The investigation found no evidence that an exercise including a large number of people representing the vessel's maximum passenger capacity was ever performed. In 2018, the City of Toronto had conducted an emergency drill involving approximately 50 people who acted as the role of passenger. This was the largest number of people that had been involved in an emergency drill. These drills did not provide an opportunity to confirm if the evacuation procedures would be feasible during a real emergency, when the vessel would be at full capacity. The life-saving equipment regulations require that all passenger vessels have a procedure that outlines how all passengers and crew members will be evacuated from the vessel within 30 minutes of the abandoned ship signal being given. And although this regulatory requirement is in place, Transport Canada has no formal procedure to assess if this requirement is being met. Therefore, the Board recommends that Transport Canada implement a formal validation and approval process for passenger vessel evacuation procedures. This occurrence also highlights the need to have an accurate count of passengers. When people were boarding the Sam McBride or other Toronto Island Park ferries, the total number was only estimated using a handheld tally counter, and children, infants, and those who may require extra assistance were not counted separately. Without this information, there is no way to determine whether there is an adequate number of life jackets available and in the appropriate sizes for everyone on board. At the time of the occurrence, the Sam McBride carried 183 child-sized life jackets. The investigation found that on some voyages, there were many more children on board than the number of child-sized life jackets. Estimating isn't good enough. If there's no method to accurately count the passengers as they board a vessel, there's a risk that not all passengers will be accounted for in an emergency. And plus, if a crew does not identify those that require special care or assistance during an emergency, their safety may be compromised. Therefore, the Board recommends that Transport Canada implement a process to validate that passenger vessels are keeping an accurate count of all passengers, including a separate count of the number of children and infants on all voyages. The Sam McBride occurrence highlighted the vulnerabilities related to passenger management in ferry operations and the importance that must be put on passenger safety. Ferry passengers aren't safety experts. They rely on vessel operators to bring them from point A to point B safely. However, the responsibility doesn't just fall to vessel owners and crew. Safety is a shared responsibility, and passengers need to pay attention to the safety briefings and follow safety instructions from crews. Furthermore, Transport Canada also needs to ensure that effective regulations are in place and validated so that if and when disaster strikes, passengers are in safe hands. Thank you.
Nous allons maintenant procéder avec la présentation en français. À vous la parole, Monsieur Marilly.
Bonjour à tous et merci de vous joindre à nous.
All right, a report coming out this morning from that crash of the Jack Layton ferry terminal, the Sam McBride ferry. Really kind of startling revelations and suggestions and recommendations from the TSB here. 6 crew on board of a 910-passenger vessel. It had made 8 crossings already. They're talking about the minimum number of crew members needs to be significantly higher than that. Also pointing out none of the crew members had proper or even mandatory training for passenger safety management, so they're recommending the implementation of that. Also in emergency evacuation measures that etc. So several key recommendations coming out of this situation that, of course, unfolded 2 years ago, almost to the day. We know, of course, 20 people approximately were injured. 6 were hospitalized. Most of the injuries are from falling down or kind of losing their balance after the vessel, the Sam McBride, kind of crashed into the Jack Layton terminal on the dock there, again, 2 years ago. So we'll have more from this throughout the morning there, but those are sort of the main headlines coming out of the TSB's report this morning.